From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again and welcome to the show. So I heard Bill Ayers being interviewed yesterday about his new book, and he expressed some real optimism about the current public education picture in Chicago. He called Chicago ground zero for the destruction of public education. That's a direct quote. But then he praised the CTU. He said they're fighting alongside parents for an education that's decent in a democracy. And that made me even more anxious to get in here today and talk with today's guest, because it's George Schmidt. He just might be the dean of journalists covering Chicago public schools. He's been at it for decades, and his knowledge of CPS budgets, in my opinion, I've observed a few times that he often knows more about the budgets than the public officials who are responsible for managing those budgets. But he's also an activist. He's strongly allied with the current CTU, and the battle between the CTU and the Emanuel administration has been well documented here and in other places. But a lot of observers have said that the CTU may be the last and best hope for collective bargaining, having won some, as we know, pretty impressive victories over the last couple of years. But while battles are being won, is the war being lost? Thousands of layoffs of teachers, support staff, a whole bunch of schools closed, maybe 50 of them, and now the news that neighborhood high schools, as we've always known them, are withering away. Some of them have only a couple of hundred students left. The fight for quality traditional public education, it could be argued, is slowly being lost in Chicago as parents opt more and more for the quasi-private corporate alternatives that are being offered to them. And remember, this attack on traditional public education is being led by a new breed of Democrats, the Emanuel Obama Duncan wing of the party. So where's organized labor's traditional alliance with the Democratic Party? Where's it led them? Well, has there been too much emphasis on politics and too little organizing? That's one of the questions we want to ask George about today. Oh, George, there's so much to talk about. Stop me while I...
Well, let's start.
Let's just talk. All right.
Neighborhood high schools.
Neighborhood high schools. That's in the news.
Well, first of all...
Could we just say some numbers?
Well, rather than say numbers, because you have a lot of schools that have a lot, are still generally successfully serving those communities. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the Board of Education for at least the past 50 years has been sabotaging the neighborhood high schools in different ways. So this is not something new. The new piece is the charter schools are given so much preference in ripping off the kids and then sending back, and this is important, sending back the kids they don't want after they get their money for the year. This is one of the tricks. You know, you get your money in October, and then in January you send the kids to Kelvin Park or Amundsen, or in the case of the one I know best, Steinmetz. So that you do have some of these schools where the charter schools have been really embedded in the west side and south side, where the numbers in neighborhood high schools are very low. But on the other hand, you have an almost propaganda campaign coupled with fiscal sabotage to destroy the neighborhood high schools. You will find a lot of young yuppie, for want of a better word, families on the northeast side who don't even know that they've got a really good couple of neighborhood high schools nearby. They think if their kid can't go to Walter Payton, it's the end of the world. Well, you've got Lakeview, you've got Amundsen, you've got places, Sen, which just had its anniversary, which will give you all the educational opportunities you can want. But if you don't believe that they exist, what's going to happen? I mean, I personally think, for example, the best high school newspaper in Chicago right now is the Steinmetz Star, which is, I think we have the sponsor is my wife.
So, yes.
And it's very good. It says we're best in the West.
Yeah.
And Steinmetz is a neighborhood high school. Mm-hmm. But if you go all the way back to the 60s, there's been this push for magnet schools, preferential treatment schools, and as a result, the neighborhood high schools have faced these challenges. I just think the sabotage has increased with the movement to charters.
All right, now,
that's it.
All right, now let's do some of those numbers. In 2003 and 4, that school year, there were 104,000 students enrolled in 106 high schools in Chicago. Move forward 10 years to today, 112,000. So enrollment's actually gone up 8%, which is something, if you stop people on the street, they wouldn't believe. The enrollment's actually gone up. But that enrollment is now shared over 154 high schools. So, it's like a 50% increase in the number of high schools. Neighborhood high schools are now attended by only about a third of kids who are going to high school in Chicago. And the district-run high schools, their enrollment has dropped by 5% this year. There are 11 of 91 high schools that are now below 600 kids, and Noble Street has 14 schools with 2 of them coming. I know that's just a bunch of numbers, but what it really says is that this kind of image that you have of the sort of the big hulking high school in the middle of the neighborhood, those schools are becoming less relevant.
Well, I don't think they're less relevant because they're the place where the kids wind up. I mean, Noble Street and Milky, the head of Noble Street, pioneered the move out of the local public school, take the best kids, and then send back the ones who aren't going to keep your test scores up. And they've been doing it as the Noble network has expanded since the beginning. Milky began as a math teacher at Wells High School. And he was not wildly successful with the kind of kids that you get at Wells High School. The charter school thing just enabled him to create this thing, and then the marketing money that's gone into that against places like Wells has enabled them to drain off the kids up to a certain point, and then they send the kids back. So that's one factor. There's another factor I think is important. The budgetary crunch has faced the general high schools, and that's what I call them traditionally, more so than ever. Last but not least, that number of 150 high school is there's some high schooly thingies out there that were invented for particularly strange community-based prejudices. My favorite example is Ogden International, where they had the Ogden, which is the Gold Coast Elementary School over there at State and Oak, and they expanded to include a high school piece, and they took over Carpenter Elementary, which is just west of the Kennedy Expressway. The building wasn't meant to be a high school. It shouldn't have been a high school, but they were so, the people who lobbied, the wealthiest people, some, including Korshak, was involved in the lobbying for the high schooly thingy for Ogden. It was just an example of what was going on. There's about a dozen of them I can list, and almost all of them are in these communities that have a boutique sense of what they want, and then they get it because they have the clout, sometimes under the table. You don't see it, and suddenly you have Disney 2 over there in Old Irving Park, where you can't buy a home for less than $750,000. They didn't need it. They did not need it. Schurz High School is right there. If you put the same resources into Schurz, you wouldn't have had to invent Disney 2. You wouldn't have to do Ogden if you're putting the resources into Wells. That's my answer to that.
All right, now, but here's the thing. We're both older gentlemen. We've both been around Chicago a long time. I went to Chicago public schools my entire time here. And even in the 60s, the general high schools were not so great, most of them. I mean, let's face it, they really weren't. And part of the reason why you have this move to bring in specialty schools and magnet schools and all the rest is because there was a huge pressure to try to get out of those general high schools. Would you agree with that?
In some cases, that was the case. It wasn't true in all the communities in the city, and it was there was a kind of a vicious racist component to this that everybody, as soon as you say, oh yes. The best example I can think of is the so-called Southwest Side. The Southwest Side is the phrase Chicago used to define where the white people moved to as the black people expanded through the South Side. So at one point, the Southwest Side ended around Halsted Street, then Racine, then Ashland. Then it was always possible to drive more readily through the black part as the black people moved farther west. Well, now, at the last Board of Ed meeting, they were talking about the people from the Southwest Side don't have a college prep high school to go to, and they're complaining. Well, at the same time, the 3 college prep academic magnet high schools in the South Side, Lindblom, King, and Brooks, are under-enrolled. Peyton's over-enrolled, and Northside College Prep and Jones. Those are the white part of town schools. If the board continues to allow that racist segregationist viewpoint, and they did have that discussion at the September board meeting, then you're going to get this craziness that we've had throughout the years that we're talking about that we live. I taught at 17 of the city's general high schools, from DuSable and Tilden to Bowen, which was my last posting. And at every one of them, if we'd have had the resources, and this goes back to 1969 when I was at DuSable, we could have done a lot better, but there was always that squeeze. And then the perception thing destroys you, so that even in the late 60s, when DuSable still had the memory of Harold Washington and all these people on the Wall of Fame who had attended DuSable, it was like, well, but that's DuSable. Well, DuSable was built to be the black school. It was the first completely segregated high school construction in Chicago. I checked the history. I asked the black people who went there in the 30s, was there ever a white person here? And I got an answer. Yeah, once. He really loved his girlfriend. So, but...
Well, I've seen the yearbook pictures from then, so yeah.
So if we continue these strange Chicago-ish things, like this Southwest side is wherever the white people moved to, we're going to get this crazy result where you have seats that you could use at a place like King or Lindblom or Brooks. And you have people saying, with the Board of Education saying, yeah, we probably should build you a new school out there on the Southwest side. Come on. Let's talk about making all the high schools true. Last but not least, the general high schools in the suburbs, from Glenbard West to New Trier, you can cite a dozen examples as soon as I say it, are having no problem. It's the peculiar history and nature of Chicago politics and education politics that got us into this pickle. If suddenly somebody declared, for the next 20 years, the general high school is what this city needs. Because the neighborhoods need these histories. The neighborhoods need these traditions. We're sorry we destroyed the Red West basketball tradition, for example, that gave so much exciting basketball until 20 years ago when literally the board began destroying it to the point where you don't have that anymore. Wow, well, we could do this. We could with resources, but we can't if we're starving the schools and then blaming them and allowing these people to make these elitist demands, like Ogden, to have their own little boutique. That's my answer.
And a good answer it is, but I guess I still wonder about whether, and maybe we shouldn't take a lot of time on this, but this idea that maybe the times have changed and we just don't sort of need big general things anymore. We kind of have the ability now to do smaller, faster, better, more efficient, than maybe having lots of small high schools is better than having 80 or 90 gigantic high schools. Of course, that I'll answer myself. That doesn't happen to be true, like, let's say, in Wilmette or Evanston. But
that's my answer.
Yeah, okay,
and did Chicago need to go from 90 high schools to 150 high schooly thingies? The answer is clearly no. That was a policy that was implemented both overtly and under the table for the past 25 or 30 years. That policy could be changed. We could say we don't need these little bitty high school thingies, and we could go back and say you really should go to Schurz. You really should go to Wells, and we'll make Wells the place you want to go.
But only if Schurz and Wells are as good as they can possibly be, which they are not.
Well, good as possibly be if you would. I'll give you one simple example. My elder son, who's now successfully living in the Bay Area doing his computer thing, graduated from Whitney Young class in 2007. As a senior in high school, he designed our website. It's still running. Well, he knew from first day of school who his teachers were going to be. There was no disruption, no reprogramming, no 20th day you're going to get a new schedule. At every general high school, and I taught in them, the entire school was disrupted by Board of Ed policy because they didn't provide the school with enough teachers until the 20th day of the semester. So any kid who wound up in that school was only going to get that school year minus that percentage from the beginning. And that's one of the disruptions. The budget for sports is a joke. Even, you can go from South Shore to Mount Carmel and see the result, or from Hyde Park to Mount Carmel, which is closer geographically. And you can't just say, well, the Catholics have all these fathers clubs. You say, well, we have to support a sports program because that's part of the entire high school thing. Because you don't have any decent sports programs at these boutique-y thingies, and you never will because there's not enough
they're too
talent.
small.
So I think, if we need to have this discussion. I'm glad that it could begin. I don't think it's beginning because I watched the Board of Education, and they're tone deaf and brain dead on the question to begin with. But I think 150 high schools is more than Chicago needs. So it's time to say, that's pretty expensive. Maybe we should reconsolidate.
Yeah, and the answer is going to be, well, then let's close Hirsch. Let's close, that whole list of the high schools that have only 200 people in them that were built for 1,000.
Okay, we'll have that discussion.
Have that discussion. This is fundamentally a discussion, as are all things of this nature, about budget, because the budget determines everything that you do politically, socially, economically, emotionally. It's all budget.
Well, let's just go. The budget people at CPS really do their budgeting at Hogwarts. I mean, it's almost like a Harry Potter magic show. For a year, the city sat and heard, and now we're hearing it again. Chicago has a $1 billion deficit.
Yes, we've mentioned that a time or two here on the program.
And then suddenly, and this is up through, May, June, and July of 2013, the $1 billion deficit was supposedly driving all these cuts, the closing of 48 to 50 schools, et cetera. And then at the July Board of Education meeting, Chief Administrative Officer of CPS gets up, delivers a PowerPoint, and says, we didn't really have, basically what he said, we didn't really have a $1 billion deficit because we found $600 million in our reserves, which a year earlier they said we didn't have any reserves.
I'm sorry, I apologize to our listeners for laughing, but we have pointed that out a number of times on the program here today about that magic reserve thing.
That's why I say it's the Hogwarts version of budgeting. But another thing that's going on when we talk about sabotaging a public institution is if you go back 10 years, CPS has had 6 or 7 that I could name chiefs of the finance department. They have deliberately churned these people. So one year you're listening to a guy named Pedro Martinez, and he's talking about the budget. And I used to ask them when they had press conferences, what's the reserve as of today? Because they know that.
Well, I don't have access to that information.
Well, no, they would actually answer it because they used to do press conferences. They haven't done a press conference since Rahm took over.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think Barbara Bird Bennett's out of town every weekend back at her home in Cleveland, but that's another story because it seems like Becky Carroll is the real chief of Chicago Public Schools. She's always what is quoted. But this $1 billion deficit disappeared with a wave of the magic wand. And now we're back to the same talking point, and the problem.
And by the way, they didn't eliminate the $1 billion deficit by closing 50 schools because it ended up costing more than because they had to actually float bonds to close the schools, which we're going to be paying off for 30 years.
And it's not funny where all the things all the tragedies that came from the closing of those schools is unconscionable. There was no transition plan. The only transition plan they had for closing those schools was, let's push the kids into the receiving school if possible. They called it the welcoming schools, which is this Kafka-esque thing that goes on here. And then the other thing was to white out the names of the schools. We discovered that story, really early on. As soon as the school was closed, they sent teams around to put white borders on the sign that used to say like Marcus Garvey or Matthew Henson Elementary School, where Jesse Owens was most famous. And it was disgusting. But the plan was the talking point. Well, we have to close schools to save money, but nobody should look at whether we're actually saving money because we're lying about everything, but we get away with it because partially, I guess, there's not enough reporters in Chicago left actually covering this stuff.
Well, yeah, I think that we could get into the state of journalism, but I think we've bitten off enough for one discussion here. So the $1 billion deficit, or whatever you want to call it, the $1 billion budget hole, was said almost exclusively to be because of the fact that they had to pay all of you union thugs and teachers for these huge pensions that you're getting. That really is the problem. Now, of course, we all know that the real problem here is the fact that mayors and legislators over the last 10 or 15 years have taken holidays, pension holidays, and that has caused that's just blown these huge holes in the budget. But the question I wanted to ask you today is instead of just sitting here wringing our hands about the fact that all of these horrible things have happened in the past, the building either is on fire or has burned down, depending on how you want to look at the analogy, and now we're picking through the rubble. What do you do? What do you do about the pension crisis?
Well, first of all, there's not a pension crisis. There are pensions that face different problems. I mean, the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club has pushed this pension crisis singular line since the first times they started meeting over in the State of Illinois building when I was covering it 2 years ago when Dee Meyer was there representing Eden Martin and the Civic Committee. It's a pension crisis. Well, that's not what's going on. You know, most of the municipal pensions in Illinois were fully funded. The only reason the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, which is separate from the state fund, ran into trouble was that in 1995, Mayor Daley got the power not to have the tax line any longer going in straight into the pension. The pension had been viable for 100 years.
And was fully funded.
And was fully funded and even overfunded. But as soon as it went over 100% of fundings, the funding formula, they said, well, this is terrible. This is money that should be going to wherever, you know, whatever the project might be. And then
I think the argument was put this back into the schools. We need to build new schools. We need to repair schools. Let's take that money for that.
The prudent person on the other side, if the investment hedge funder who was trying to sell you the 401k because they just took away your defined benefit plan, they would say, well, you've got to put aside a certain amount of money. But they don't say that when it's the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. The last big hit on the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund was the $1.2 billion hit that Ron Huberman got Senator Cullerton and those two agreed to in April of 2010, 3 months before Karen Lewis in court took over the union, took office in the union. And that was a total scam. That was based on the talking point that Huberman was selling at that point, which he was gone within a year. You know, according to what I was told, Cullerton asked him, what'll happen if we don't give you this 3-year pension holiday? And Huberman said, we can't open school in September. Well, that was based on the lie about the deficit. There was a lot of alternatives, but when that $1 billion was taken out of the pension fund during those 3 years, that created a hole that is going to have to be repaired. But it's not a fatal hole.
Well, all right, okay.
If you look at each of the pension funds, the state teachers, the TRS is different from Chicago teachers. Police, firefighters, laborers, those are separate funds. And then you go downstate, you've got to examine each one. Illinois does not have a pension crisis. There's just one Kafkaesque wording thing here that I always love. When you talk about a deficit, you're talking about a projection of revenues and expenses going into the future. But as soon as a dumb reporter, which is the majority who are covering this, gets a hold of it, you go from a deficit, which is a future possibility, to debt. So if you listen to the stories, we're talking about the debt. You know, Illinois is facing $1 trillion, whatever the latest talking point is, pension debt. No, Illinois has different pension problems. That's a projected deficit, which has to be solved, but it's not this mess that they're talking about, despite Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch.
In the interest of just time, how do you begin to solve that? There's only one way. You have to get that from taxes. You have to raise taxes. And each of these pensions has their own issue. Right?
Exactly.
So when you add them all up, you're talking about real money, as they say. And so it's a serious question. So then the body politic says, hell no, we're not going to give you that kind of money. You just take it away from all those people who get all those pensions. I don't get a pension. Deal with that.
Well, people have had their pensions stolen for the past 30 years. They're just coming for the public pensions after they looted all the private pensions.
Right. Well, I would agree with that. I would agree with that assessment. But it's
they
still,
being the ruling class in this case. But now let's go to the solution. Progressive income tax, collection of all taxes that are due. That story recently, a brilliant investigative story in the Sun-Times about how Eddie Burke gets tax benefits for these big corporate clients off the Chicago property tax. The interesting thing to me was they were talking about what City Hall loses, the Chicago budget line, but the biggest budget line on your property tax bill is Board of Ed. Board of Ed's getting ripped off for much more than the city
So every
is.
time the city loses $1, the Board of Ed is losing,
Well, and every time they take a dive because they don't contest Burke's clients effectively. And that's not necessarily true, but it is in a lot of cases. Then Burke walks through the door, his clients get it, he gets his cut, and this Board of Ed has $2, $3, $4 million less. You know, and like I think it was Everett Dirksen said years ago when we were younger.
Yes.
$1 million here, $1 million here, and one
Pretty
day you're
soon
struggling
it's,
about real money.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing. Now, on the other hand, the plutocracy has gotten away with murder financially for the past 30 years because of the line about taxes, the assault on taxes and public services, which go together. Put that together, we need progressive taxation, we need a serious review of the way in which property taxes are collected from corporations. We need an end to the tax benefits. Boom, suddenly we have more revenue.
We'll have to set aside whether that's practical in the political world or not for another discussion on another day. But it does bring up the question about politics and unions. The folks who the good citizens of Chicago elected are Democrats, at least that's what they say they are. And so you have the kind of the Obama, Rahm Emanuel, this wing of the Democratic Party that's really appears to be fairly anti-union, anti-organized labor, and pretty bold about it. So where does organized labor go at this point in this country?
First of all, I mean, the fun part about this is that Barack Obama, Rahm Emanuel, and the rest of that crowd, the neoliberal corporate elite that are now in political power, partly because of their ability to frame a narrative that made people feel good until the policies actually landed on our backs. Those people would have been to the right of Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, in terms of policy. That's an amazing fact. But, you know, if you go back, the last effective New Deal president of the United States was probably Richard Nixon. And then, you know, and there's a lot of things to talk about.
Starting the EPA.
And now we have, you know, these Democrats who are really right-wing Republicans historically in disguise. Then what do? Well, the unions have to get coherent in Springfield and elsewhere, and plans to remedy that. Our power is our ability to put people on the streets and elect people, or not to. The old Sam Gompers, you got to reward your friends and punish your enemies. Recently, the Chicago Teachers Union, under the new leadership, by the way, we got reelected with 80% of the vote, just in case Rahm missed that number. On May 17th, the members of the Chicago Teachers Union put Karen Lewis back in office with 80% of the vote. Very important fact.
1 minute.
Okay, so now we're going to be involved more intensely in political action, and I think there's going to be a lot of rewarding friends, because we have some good friends from here to Springfield and Washington, and really looking at who our enemies are, starting with, of course, Rahm Emanuel in City Hall, Chicago. He's not only going to get booed at a football game, like happened recently, he's going to find out that he doesn't have a voting base worth the sand on Lake Michigan beaches. It's going to blow away.
Next time, maybe we'll talk about that, because I just don't find myself in agreement with that. I think he's got a way stronger political base than you're giving him credit for. We'll have to leave it there. Okay. George, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. It's always great having you on the program.
It was a pleasure.
George Schmidt, Substance News. You can subscribe. You can also watch us right here on Chicago Newsroom. You watch us all the time on CAN TV, and you can catch us anytime on YouTube right here by looking at this very address right here on your internets. Join us again next week. We'll be back for another show, and we're looking forward to that. Thanks again to George Schmidt. I'm Ken Davis. See you next week.